Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to meet you. This is the Culture and Strategies Forum for the Korean Peninsula and the North. I am Giwoong, the Vice Head of the HK+ National Strategies Research Project Agency. We would like to begin a first roundtable on the theme of culture. We've had a very successful opening ceremony for the forum, and now we are going to have a discussion on culture. This is the first roundtable. We do have one key presentation and 8 panelists with us today. I'm going to briefly introduce them to you in turn. Our keynote speaker is Seong-in, who is the Executive Vice President of the Korea Foundation and Executive Director of Korea Central Asia Cooperation Forum Secretariat. Thank you. Next. From Inha University, we have Dongki, who is an assistant professor of the Frontier College. Will you please like to say hello? Next, professor of the Department of Turkish-Azerbaijani Studies at Hufs and also the director of the Center for Critical Foreign Language Education, Professor Chong Jin. Thank you very much. Next, Professor Jun-mo of the Department of International Relations at SunMoon University. Yes, thank you. Next is the honorary professor of Dongguk University of Youn and who is also a visiting professor at the Istanbul University in Turkey. Yes. Next, from Inha Women's University, a researcher at the Inha Communication and Media Research Center, Jae-won. She's also an expert on Hallyu studies. Next, Director General Choi Eun-do of the Office of Education and Public Relations at Northeast Asian History Foundation. Next, we'd like to move on to introduce Executive Advisor Han In-hee of KU China Institute at Hankuk University, who is also the President of Korea-China Social Science Association. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of our panelists and speakers with us today. We have about 90 minutes. I'm going to give Dr. Seong-in, who is our keynote speaker, the opportunity to go to the podium and speak, and I'll give about 6 minutes to the rest of the panelists. We don't have a lot of time, so I'd like to give you each about 6 minutes, and please keep to the time limit. Now we'd like to hear from Dr. Seong-in.
Professor Kang Jun-young, head of the HK+ National Strategy Research, Professor Seong Dongki, Professor Chong Jin, Professor Jun-mo, Professor Yoon Myung-chul, Dr. Lee Jae-won, and Mr. Choi Eun-do, and Professor Han In-hee, and ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor to deliver a keynote presentation on cultural contact between the Korean Peninsula and the northern region. This forum is very meaningful as it provides a platform for communication to deepen our understanding on the culture of the northern region, signified by the Silk Road, and promote exchanges of knowledge and wisdom among the participants. First of all, I'd like to discuss the importance of the northern region to Korea. To carry out the discussion, we would first like to have a clear definition of the northern region. I would like to adopt the definition provided by the Presidential Committee on Northern Economic Cooperation. The new northern policy carried out by the committee defines Eurasia as the eastern region that includes Russian Far East and the 3 northeastern provinces of China, the central region that includes Central Asia and Mongolia, and the western region that includes West Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. When it comes to the significance of the northern region to Korea, first of all, the region is a strategic place for security and logistics. The northern region is a key channel of Eurasia that connects between the Korean Peninsula and Europe, and it was called the Silk Road for trade between the West and the East. Second, the northern region is a promising new market and a source of energy and resources. This is where Korean companies can potentially participate in large-scale national projects in energy, resources development, development, construction, and infrastructure. Third, Korea and the northern countries can promote sustainable cooperation for joint prosperity based on the principle of reciprocity. Countries in this region respect economic development model of Korea. So by sharing our development experience with them and supporting their industry modernization, we can elevate the status of Korea and contribute to the global community. Fourth, there are many Korean diaspora in Sakhalin and Central Asia, thus having much emotional and cultural connection with Korea. And fifth, Altaic languages that are related to the Korean language and Ephrasia murals suggest that we can trace the root and history of the Korean people in the northern region. Given the significance of the region as I described so far, under the banner of the New Northern Policy, Korea promoted Far East development, cooperation with the 3 Chinese provinces, and cooperation with Russia for the eastern region, promoted resources development and infrastructure cooperation and cooperation in manufacturing, agriculture, and IT for the central region, and promoted science and technology cooperation for the western region. The New Northern Policy is a continental strategy. It is a policy to institutionalize multilateral cooperation with key Northeast Asian countries and better connect the Korean Peninsula with Eurasia by creating a basis for trilateral cooperation among the 2 Koreas and Russia, pursuing FTAs between Korea and EAEU, and participating in China's Belt and Road Initiative. Due to language barriers and poor business environment and investment risks involving Russian sanctions, investments and trade by Korean companies have been relatively small. But recently, the business environment has improved dramatically, and northern countries' policies to promote industry development have created opportunities for Korean companies. And thanks to the active implementation of the new northern policy, there have been many economic achievements. Construction projects by Korean companies in the region have increased, and many Korean infrastructure companies have entered the northern market. However, compared to more substantial economic cooperation, cultural cooperation has been relatively lagging behind. Of the 15 key tasks for the new Northern Policy, only one is about cultural cooperation, while the other 14 tasks are about economic cooperation. And when you look at the details of cultural cooperation, it involves the spreading of Korean content in the Eurasian region and designating 2020 as a year of cultural exchange in commemoration of the 30th anniversary of diplomatic ties with Russia, which are mainly focused on spreading our culture to these countries unilaterally. It is true that Korean culture enjoys global popularity, so the Korean government is working hard to promote our culture globally, and the strategy of spreading Korean content and Korean culture has become a key task of the new Northern Policy, and I do understand the reasons why. However, it is important to consider what kinds of impression we would leave with people in other countries when our cultural exchange and cooperation are mainly about gaining economic benefits. In promoting cultural cooperation, if it is only about creating sales market for Korean culture and content to get economic gains or unilaterally spread Korean pop culture, it may cause discomfort and dislike from the partner countries and people. Just as a balance between import and export is needed to develop bilateral trade in a stable manner, diplomacy and international exchanges need to be pursued in a balanced manner based on mutual benefit and reciprocity. And this is the only way to develop the relations in a desirable manner. In particular, culture is different from economic and trade relations because culture directly touches upon emotions and views of the people. Therefore, we need to keep in mind that unilateral spread of culture may lead to sensitive and uncomfortable reaction from the relevant governments and people. So, of course, we need to continue to share our culture, but at the same time, we need to embrace the culture of other countries and continue to communicate and share our cultures together. Now, let's take a look at what kinds of initiatives we need to pursue. First of all, there needs to be more support for intangible cultural heritage. Recently, Renewed attention has been paid to the Silk Road, which served as a trade route among ancient civilizations. As a venue for dialogue and exchange among civilizations, Central Asia was at the center of the Silk Road, thus receiving much attention in recent years. In promoting cultural cooperation, we need to shift away from cooperation on tangible cultural heritage, but we need to strengthen cooperation on intangible cultural heritage. There's not much commonality between Korea and the northern region in terms of tangible cultural assets. In Russia, there are some historical sites for the Balhae Kingdom, but it is subject to academic research, not for cultural cooperation. In Central Asia, there are some ancient Buddhist temples in Uzbekistan, but most countries have become Muslim, so it is hard to find a common ground for cooperation on tangible cultural heritage. Nevertheless, and also many countries that were on the Silk Road became Muslim states long ago, and much of the heritage and history before the conversion to Muslim were lost, with only faint traces of the ancient history present. However, many northern countries on the route of the Silk Road are highly interested in preserving their intangible cultural heritage, and they ask for technical and financial assistance from developed countries to preserve their culture. For instance, I attended a meeting to discuss the Silk Road Intangible Heritage Network that was held in November last year. And I came to recognize the urgency in preserving intangible cultural heritage of the Eurasian countries along the Silk Road. The participants from the Silk Road countries pointed out that their intangible cultural asset is disappearing because of rapid urbanization and the reduction in cultural and biological diversity. And they proposed candid exchange and cooperation with Korea for cultural preservation. They also reported that there are many intangible heritage-related festivals along the Silk Road. With the nomadic life of moving around along the pastures in the region, traditional practices and life wisdom have been transmitted orally between generations for centuries. So it is very important to identify and reinterpret such intangible heritage, and it is important to maintain vitality and sustainability of such cultural festivals. The participants also mentioned how the preservation of intangible culture can contribute to local economy. In many Silk Road countries such as Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, there are many cultural festivals along the paths on the grassland. We may find some root of the Korean people in the traditional performances of oral narratives that are quite similar to Korea's pansori, and there are nomad festivals, epic poetry recitation festivals, Nauri's New Year, and spring festivals, and so on. These festivals aim at preserving and revitalizing their traditions, and also they help boost the local economy by attracting foreign tourists. Korea needs to facilitate cultural cooperation through efforts to preserve intangible cultural heritage of the northern countries. Considering the key interests of Japan and China in the Silk Road region, if we pursue partnership and strengthen financial and technical assistance for the cultures of the northern countries, these efforts will improve Korea's image in the region and ultimately contribute to substantial economic cooperation. First of all, and I like to propose bilateral cultural cooperation. First of all, we need to introduce cultures of the northern region to the Korean people. As I mentioned earlier, it takes two hands to clap and it takes two to tango. If we want to build a mutual understanding, we need to try to get closer to one another. The same principle applies to cultural exchange. Sustainable exchange is possible when there is a similar level of understanding of each other. In this regard, there is huge demand for Korean culture in the northern region, but there is still lack of understanding of the Korean people on these countries. Therefore, we need to make more effort to introduce the cultures of the northern region to the Korean people. Organizations for international exchange, such as the Korea Foundation and Asia Culture Center, can organize exhibitions, concerts, and performances to showcase these cultural assets. Also, in Korea, there are many migrants from the northern countries. We can regularly hold festivals that resemble the festivals in the northern region and attract Korean people to these cultural events. For instance, the Korea Central Asia Cooperation Forum Secretariat has been holding Nowruz Festival, which is a major spring festival in Central Asia and is listed on UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage in Korea since 2018. The Spring Festival has served to introduce the culture and art of the Central Asian countries to Korean audience and promote cultural exchange. Third, we need to institutionalize bilateral cultural cooperation, and then we can refer to the success case of ASEAN Culture House. In order to boost Koreans' understanding of ASEAN culture, at the Korea-ASEAN Special Summit held in Busan in 2014, the Korean government announced the plan to establish ASEAN Cultural House in Busan to promote ASEAN culture in Korea. As a result, ASEAN Culture House was opened in July 2017 in Busan. It is currently run by the Korea Foundation. Since then, various exhibitions and performances were held to introduce the ASEAN culture to the Korean people and serve as a place where people from ASEAN countries living in Korea can come and enjoy their own culture. In the same vein, we need to consider establishing Eurasia Culture House to introduce culture of the northern region to Korean people. This place can exhibit cultures of northern countries to the Korean public and help find the root of the Korean people and restore culture of ethnic Koreans in the northern region. Third, I'd like to propose cooperation to preserve culture of the Koryo Saram. Ethnic Koreans in the former Soviet territories are divided between Sakhalin Koreans and Koryo Saram. Sakhalin Koreans migrated to Russia in the 1940s and they operated Korean language schools until mid-60s and issued Korean language newspaper until before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they were able to preserve the Korean culture and language to a certain extent. However, situations for the Koryo Saram who moved to Central Asia were very different. In 1937, they were forcibly relocated and they lost freedom to use the language. In 1937, Stalin forced Korea people in the Far East and Siberia to move to Central Asia, and Korea schools were converted to regular Soviet schools in 1938 that provided education in the Russian language. Because of this historical background, Koryo Saram do not speak Korean very well. As a result, they have gradually lost their traces of oral traditions and expressions. By engaging in cultural cooperation with northern countries, we can support the initiatives to protect cultures of ethnic minorities, such as Koryo Saram, and help preserve the root of the Korean people. As for the means to do so, we can cooperate with the counterpart government organizations to conduct a field survey to identify valuable intangible heritage among life cultures of Koryo Saram so that these can be collected and preserved systematically. I would like to express my appreciation to the organizers for hosting this Culture and Strategy Forum for the Korean Peninsula and the North. I am confident that today's forum will help strengthen our friendship and our relations between the two regions. I believe that this forum serves as an opportunity to reflect on cultural cooperation of the past and the present and discuss ways to promote further constructive cooperation going forward between the two regions. I would like to wish the success of the forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Kim Seong-in, the Executive Vice President of the Korea Foundation and Executive Director of the Korea Central Asia Cooperation Forum Secretariat, who gave his keynote speech. He's talking about how we can promote universal values, and this research agenda can allow us for transnational communication, ways where we have cultural connectivity. We do have several panelists with us today. We have 67 minutes now remaining. I'm going to give you about 7 minutes each. Just a brief housekeeping announcement. We also have these souvenirs for you. Your nameplates have been laser engraved, so those are souvenirs for you. And outside there are also ceramics, pottery souvenirs with your names engraved as well. So please make sure you don't take somebody else's souvenir. Please make sure your names are engraved on them. And also the proceedings in front of you, these are not complete. After today's event is over, we're going to have final proceedings published in Korean, English, and Russian. So congratulatory remarks and your speeches and the discussion notes will be published in new booklets and handed to you. So first we'd like to hear from Seong Dongki, assistant professor at the Inha University, for his remarks. Hello, it is a pleasure to meet you. I'm Dongki. When I go to academic symposiums or speak at forums, I typically am last to speak, but today I'm the first to speak. So this is very surprising for me. This is very unexpected. But in any case, I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this forum. And I do hope that through this forum we can talk about further ways to deepen the cultural ties and cooperation between Korea and the northern countries. I listened well to Kim Seong-in's keynote speech, and he was very accurate in his understanding of the situation. Going forward, I hope that cultural cooperation and the deepening of cultural exchange will be done between Korea and northern countries. I studied in Uzbekistan, and Inha University also has a campus called IUT in Uzbekistan called Inha University in Tashkent. And I also worked there for about 2 years, teaching Uzbek students, trying to offer the Uzbek students the knowledge that they want to know about Korean culture and Korean history. So that is why I've been asked to come here today. I listened well to the keynote speech. And it always appears that there are instances where we feel that cooperation is going well, but there are always something missing. I've had 2 incidents in the past. There is something called the Korean Studies Golden Time. It is a TV documentary, and I watched this called Korean Studies Golden Time. And when I saw this documentary, I was able to see that people around the world, they know K-pop well, they know Korean culture, they know Hallyu very well, but if you ask them to place Korea on a map, they don't know exactly where Korea is on the globe. That's because people only understand Korea from the point of view of popular culture. So I think it's important for us to move beyond that very narrow set of perspectives and broaden those perspectives. Another incident is when we issued a survey on the international students at our university, at Inha University. We asked them about public diplomacy and various different areas. We also asked them, what year did the Korean War erupt? What year was the World Cup hosted in Korea? These are very important historical questions. The answers, I think about 70% had an accuracy. 1950 Korean War, 2002 World Cup, 1988 were the Seoul Olympics. So the accuracy rate for these questions were about 70%, so I was very surprised. Of course, these students have a high interest of Korea, and that's why they came to study in Korea. So this may not be very surprising, but I have to say I was shocked at the high level of accuracy. When we engage in cultural exchange with the northern countries, we cannot reach out literally to everyone in this region, but we have to understand what the demand is, and we have to understand their level of understanding. So, for example, what is the university students' level of understanding of Korean culture? What is their demand? What is their need for understanding Korean culture? And that could be different from the average public. So we have to really understand the needs of the public and needs of the consumers and offer a sort of a customized knowledge and expertise that they want. What are the areas of cooperation that we have to identify? I know that many of you here are working on that and trying to identify the key areas of cooperation. If I were to give you my personal experience, when I was in Uzbekistan, one scholar came up to me and said that in Korea, there is this culture of filial piety. And Uzbekistan also is known for its large families, and it's very similar to what Korea was like in the 70s. It's very patriarchal. And in Uzbekistan, they also have that feeling of filial piety for your elders and for your parents. In this area, many people know that some areas are very Islam, but in some parts of Central Asia, there is also the Turkic cultures, the nomadic culture that is very prevalent there. That culture is still lives on to this day. So if we identify those similarities, those cultural values, then I think that we can find areas where many of our elements can overlap. And another area that I was very much moved was this idea of the Eurasian cultural community, so culture house. As has been said, it takes two to tango. We shouldn't just focus on how international citizens or foreigners perceive us. We should also try to understand the northern cultures ourselves. I don't want to stray too far from the topic, but I think that this issue of low birth rates and population aging is the single biggest challenge for the Korean population. And I know that the government is trying to come up with different ways to get out of this challenge. They also have a presidential committee on low birth rates and aging. I think that another way for us to resolve this issue is through immigration with ethnic Koreans, the Korean diaspora who live in other countries, for them to come live in Korea to try to bridge the gap in a population. And for us to get to that level, because right now I think the consensus is not that positive, we have to identify with them, identify with the ethnic Koreans and with the Korean diaspora abroad. We have to understand those areas where we are different from them and those areas where we are similar from them, or similar with them. To be completely honest, there is an image problem with ethnic Koreans, but I think that we should try to reach out to broaden our understanding about ethnic Koreans and try to see where we do have similarities so that we can solve this issue of low birth rates and population aging. These ethnic Koreans in the diaspora living in the northern regions their values can be more introduced here in Korea, so that later on, perhaps, we can avoid any room for conflict. I know I'm almost out of time, but I just want to say that we have to come up with the Ethnic Korean Cultural Museum. And this is very important because many of these older generation ethnic Koreans have passed away, but they do have a heritage, cultural heritage, that is very important. So if we can create a museum and ask them to bring their elements to us, cultural artifacts, their genealogical artifacts, many of these treasures that are just sitting in their homes can be brought to the museum. And I think that that would be very helpful. So that is my 2 cents. Thank you very much. Thank you for your remarks. Next, we'd like to move on to Professor Chong Jin at the Department of Turkish-Azerbaijani Studies at Tufts and the Director of Center for Critical Foreign Language Education. You have 7 minutes.
Good afternoon. As was introduced, I am Chong Jin from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. I'm very nice to meet all of you. I am actually also part of the HK+ research project, and as was introduced, I am director of the Center for Critical Foreign Language Education, which is funded by the government budget. And also, I am involved in the official Turkish Cultural Institute. I am the director of that institute as well. What we are discussing today is about various programs that are promoting the new Northern policy. And I understand that all of us in this panel are involved in these programs, so I want to share with you my thoughts. But before that, I'd like to mention that the keynote presentation was very impressive, and it made me think that things in Korea are changing quite rapidly because as was pointed out by the keynote presentation, we need to keep these important points in mind. In the past, we had many names, such as the Eurasian Initiative and other policies, but so far it was mainly focused on economic cooperation and exchanges related to the Korea people. But whatever initiatives we are involved in, I believe that it has to be based on the understanding of the other culture. In the Turkish cultures, there are many similar cultures and languages between this region and Korea, and there's a lot that we can research on. So going forward, when we think about the economic, political, and cultural realm of these two regions, I think that, as was mentioned by Mr. Kim, we need to engage in many different forms and many different types of exchange between the two regions. So in that sense, the new Northern policy and the relevant programs are going to be very meaningful. In the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed. Then came about this emergence of the new region called Central Asia. Turkey is not directly really included in the Central Asia, but Turkey has a lot to do with this region because Turkey thinks that there are roots and there are many commonalities between Turkey and Central Asia, and the West has been supporting Turkey in playing a role in Central Asia and the Eurasian region. So in the early 1990s, Turkey served as a big brother to facilitate economic, political, cultural, and educational development in this Central Asian region. However, as you may know very well, this region, when it comes to its relations to Russia and the US and other mega power countries, they have exercised their influence on this region. So even though Turkey was trying to play its role actively, they felt the limitations. So since the mid-1990s, they decided to give up on that. And they began to switch their attention to developing soft power, such as culture and education. So there was a lot of education support, for instance, by building primary and secondary schools. And also, they promoted cultural exchanges among college students, for instance. So each year, 20,000 college students from Central Asia would come to Turkey to get education. So their strategy has been focused on culture and education. That kind of initiative began in 1995. And then they have received a very positive response from the Turk countries in Central Asia. When Turkey was trying to play the role of a big brother, there was not much positive acceptance. But now, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and these countries have recognized the role of Turkey and the contribution of Turkey to their countries. So Turkey is not no longer a big brother, but a great partner for culture, history, and educational development. Given this situation, what Turkey did was, for instance, Turksoy. It is serving as sort of a UNESCO in the Turk region. So the ministers will each take turns in discussing how to cultivate culture and how to foster their common culture. As far as I know, Korea has been attending Turksoy as an observer, but we can become more active in this association, and there are Turkish-speaking community of states and also Turk consultative body. And these bodies and these organizations are engaged in cultural exchange. Likewise, as was mentioned in the keynote presentation, we have much in common with this Turk region in terms of history and culture. And if we deepen our cooperation with them, we can also get some economic and other benefits. There are many political consultative frameworks and bodies in place, but rather than just focusing on political and economic aspect, I think we need to focus on culture and education as well. We have the Eurasian Initiative and other ideas that have been put forth, but when you think about this term Eurasia, this was a term coined by Russia. So instead, I think that the new northern policy or the new northern region is a more appropriate term. And there's Altai culture and the new northern policy and the new Turk belt. These are some of the ideas that we can consider, because when you think about what China is doing with its Belt and Road Initiative, they are trying to add their own color in developing this region. So likewise, Korea would have to come up with its own approach by utilizing the Altai culture that the Korean culture is rooted on, and then we can exploit these cultural assets. In the Central Asian region, there's many Turk ethnic groups who live in this area, so we can utilize this. And so, towards this region, as was discussed before, in the keynote presentation, we can develop intangible cultural asset together. For instance, I am involved in the Turkish Cultural Institute in Korea, and my mission is to find a way to promote exchanges of archery between Korea and Turkey, because just when you think about this Turk archery culture, there's a lot of pride in doing so. There's traditional wrestling, and there is archery and the hawk hunting and many other many other traditions there. And in the Turk region, there are many oral traditions, such as the oral narratives that are orally transmitted to the next generation. And we have such oral traditions in our culture as well. So if we continue to identify these common traditions and utilize them, we can deepen our relations further. There are many regions around the world, but the new northern region is very attractive to us because we have many commonalities in terms of language, history, and culture. There's a lot of organic connection between Korea and the new northern region compared to North America and Europe and other regions. I think we have a lot in common, so that's why we need to utilize that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks. You have spoken from your extensive field experience and your academic expertise. Thank you very much. Next, we'd like to hear from Professor Jun-mo of SunMoon University. Can you hear me? Yes. Hello. I've just been introduced. My name is Jun-mo, professor at SunMoon University. As you can see, I'm a professor of international relations, international politics. So when we talk about a new northern policy and exchange with new northern region, I think we would all benefit from a brief description of the international political context and international relations before I move on. After Biden administration came into power, many people talk about how America is back and we're going to see a values alliance. And when we hear this terminology of values alliance, we can think of democracy, human rights, liberalism, market economy, many of these countries that share similar values, that the alliances with these countries will be reaffirmed by President Biden, and that the America First policy under President Trump will be retreated. In the first half of 2020, in the 20th century, we've seen how the Western powers engaged in warfare and brought about a lot of conflict across the world. It was the United States who led the way out of that and come up with a liberal, free market world order for the world. And America wants to regain that spirit again, trying to bring about rule of law, uphold democracy, and create a world that is based on those values. And for them to affirm this, President Biden said that in foreign affairs, he said that he's going to even host a summit on democracy. This shows that the United States wants to come up with a standard for civilization. And because the United States wants to lead this way going forward, that other countries should engage in alliance with this standard that the United States wants to set. And the United States wants to put all these different countries in line against the standard. Those countries who do not wish to follow this standard, or those blocs that do not want to follow this standard, would be seen as anti-democratic, which would be seen as barbaric. And these countries would be seen as countries that should be ousted from the values alliance that the United States wants to promote. This is the global leadership or restoration of order as promulgated by President Biden. This puts us in a very tight spot because we can say one side says that we have to strengthen our Chorus alliance, but other side says that the alliance is just there to guarantee safety and security, but because we have our relations with China to think about, we shouldn't risk all of everything and put all of our eggs in the basket of the Chorus alliance. So there is definitely conflict here in Korea as well. I've been talking about the United States for 3 minutes now because when I think about the situation, I am reminded of Baekbum Kim-gu, who is a patriotic leader for the country of Korea. In 1947, this was not long before his passing, but as a future vision for the Republic of Korea, he said that the power of culture, it is truly the power of culture, which is what I really want for our new country, that we should go away from an arrogant mind, a selfish mind, and I do hope that the Korean people can become a new standard for the world in whole. This was back when I was a young student and I was studying the lessons of Kim Koo. And if I were to read back over those studies of him that I looked at in the past, it's that we don't want a spirit that will try to dominate the world order, but it's a culture of the spirit, culture of the world, culture of peace, and this culture will bring about a better world, a world of prosperity for not just us, but for all mankind as a whole. This is the teachings of Kim Koo in his text. And in the end, he also talks about the importance of education. Kim Koo was himself an educator, and he left behind his teachings because he knew that he does not have a lot left to live, and he wanted to stress how important education is. Education would promote values and promote culture. Cultural education is included in his teachings about education. I think that this values alliance under Biden administration, I have to say I'm not a big fan of how he's trying to make countries choose sides under values alliance. So I do want to urge all of you to read Baekbum Kim-koo's teachings, either on Digital Times or HK+ National Strategies Research Project Agency. Maybe you can send a link of the English text to the White House in the United States. Now I'd like to just give my thoughts on one of the proposals made by the keynote speech. I read over Mr. Kim Seong-in's speech at home, and I was deeply impressed by his words on a cultural cooperative aspect on how we can try to preserve intangible cultural heritage. And I think that that is very meaningful. So I looked at some actual case examples. There's digital cultural content that we can help to record and preserve and document for northern countries. And this can later on have absolute value for all of humankind. I know you've seen recently how in the New York Christie's auction, the non-fungible token artwork was sold for a huge sum. These NFT artworks were sold at Christie's. And I think that if we were to learn from that, because we do have excellent digital technology and IT technology here, and you've mentioned how the cultural, rich, extensive cultural heritage in the northern countries in the Altaic region, maybe we can create these digital cultural content and have that registered as non-fungible token. That could also be an absolute cultural heritage that our countries can all share. Thank you very much for sharing us your dreams. And with that, I would like to conclude my comments. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Woo Chun-mo. I know that we were very much deeply touched and inspired by Baekbum Kim-koo's teachings in My Wish. And yes, as you mentioned, we are going to send that link to the White House if we can. Next, we'd like to move on to Professor Youn Myung-chul, who's an honorary professor at Hankuk University. And he's also a visiting professor at the Turkey Institute.
Good afternoon. I am Youn Myung-chul, honorary professor at Hankuk University. Istanbul University visiting professor that expired, but I actually got appointed to another university, but I was not able to be there in person due to the pandemic, so I'm providing my classes through online platform. It's Samarkand University. I enjoyed the keynote presentation as well as the panel discussions. I believe that these comments are very helpful. I have a couple of questions regarding the keynote presentation. I studied Korean history and also East Asian history, and I am not an expert on Eurasian history, but I've been studying Eurasian history recently. So in this regard, I'd like to make some points, and I would also like to make some suggestions. As Professor Chong Jin mentioned, we need to have a definition of Eurasia. And the economic, the political, and the academic circles need to collaborate in coming up with a definition. And as I believe that there was some confusion that was in the keynote presentation as well with respect to the definition. So political, economic, and historical, but also cultural and other aspects need to be included in coming up with a definition. Since Rotae government, the Northern Policy was initiated, and the Eurasian Initiative by President Park Geun-hye, and currently it's the new Northern Policy. And as we have had all these policies, there has been some shortage in terms of making progress. And I believe that there's many other aspects that were not included in the keynote presentation. And you know the term Silk Road, and I was involved in revitalizing the Silk Road. The Silk Road may mean many different things. So I hope that the research project agency will not only discuss the role of the Silk Road, but also other routes that exist in Eurasia. We need to identify the facts about ancient trade routes, because the Silk Road is one of the 6 ancient trade routes that were in Central Asia. And there are many events and there are many incidents that are involved in the Silk Road, and we need to have a full understanding of this. And as was mentioned by the previous panel members, when you think about Europe, China, and Japan, they have been very interested in Central Asia. It was not just about cultural exchange, but also from the imperial perspective. Just like the Belt and Road Initiative of China, we need to approach Central Asia more strategically. And he mentioned about the Siberian area and the Sakhalin area, but we need to also pay attention to the Siberia and the Kamchatka Peninsula. These are not just geographical definitions, but also based on my research and my writing, they have a lot of historical and cultural connection with Korea and the surrounding areas. And Turkey is, of course, at the core of this region. So we have Turkey and the West Asia and the Black Sea. These areas need to be included as well. So I believe that the keynote presentation has to include all these different areas. And you mentioned in your keynote presentation that the Altaic languages are a part of our roots, but it's not the main root. But there are 8 different roots that have later resulted in the formation of the ethnic Korean people. And there are many hypotheses and many theories about how the Korean ethnic people have come about. So we need to be more careful about that. And you made a distinction between tangible and intangible cultural heritage. But according to cultural research, there are many tangible cultural assets that are out there. And even before the Bronze Age, there have been many historical sites from the ancient Joseon all the way to Sinna and Goryeo and Joseon. There are many tangible cultural assets that are out there. Of course, there are a lot of intangible cultural assets as well. But when you think about archaeological study, they base their research on facts. But when you think about intangible cultural asset, there may be some arguments that are made not based on facts, but based on some assumptions. This may be quite dangerous in carrying out academic research. Now, moving on to the term Hallyu. As you may know, generally speaking, there was China that first used the term Hallyu and was used in Japan and also in Korea. And some people misunderstand Hallyu as a recent phenomenon, but just like the biological root, Hallyu is indeed a very comprehensive term that refers to all the Korean culture and history. So it should not be just considered as a recent phenomenon. And when you think about cultural exchanges between Korea and the surrounding countries, it goes all the way back to the past in the ancient times as well. So we need to find the root of Hallyu. And we also have to find the underlying philosophy of Hallyu. So there's a lot of things that we need to do. And we also, of course, have to try to understand their culture by identifying our common grounds, because what they have in their traditions may reflect the older version or the older aspects of Hallyu that we see today. We sometimes translate this Hallyu as the Korean wave, and I wonder if this expression is accurate. Not only here, but also in many universities, there are Eurasian research projects underway. I believe that now is a good opportunity to discuss the identity of Korean culture, identity and the meaning and significance of Hallyu from a more academic perspective. And this is what we need to do as scholars. And I would like to also ask one more thing from the keynote speaker. Culturally and economically, Korean companies were not really in the Eurasia since the mid-1990s, and we need to understand the reasons why there was not much involvement of Korean companies in these Eurasian markets. We need to understand the specific reasons why. What were the stumbling blocks? What were the obstacles? Only when we understand the reasons, we can make progress going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Youn, for your very sharp and insightful comments. We don't use the term Eurasia in our agenda. We refer specifically to the northern region. So this refers to the region where we can access by land, not by sea or by air, but by land. Next, we'd like to move on to our next speaker, researcher at Inha Communication and Media Research Center at Inha Women's University, Lee Jae-won, who is also a Hallyu expert. So I'd like to begin my discussion. Listening to Mr. Kim Seong-in's keynote presentation, I thought that he was promoting a very important new paradigm. What I'm about to talk about now is the Korean wave entertainment content that has been prevalent in Korea since the late 1990s for the past 20 years or so. So if we take a look at Hallyu from that perspective, and if we see how Hallyu has developed, we've seen how some people, we have to venture into and make inroads into certain markets and attract certain markets. But in Mr. Kim's presentation, he said that we shouldn't try to attract or target certain destinations, but that we have to engage in cooperation with these different audiences and consumers. And that is the context that I want to talk about today. In the end of the 1990s, when Hallyu first became popular, we've seen how in Japan, in China, and Taiwan, it started with K-pop. And in the early 2000s, we've seen how there was K-TV or K-TV dramas that were very popular in Japan. And up until the mid-2000s, we've seen explosive popularity in Southeast Asia. And this was the impetus to allow us to also venture into North American market. Now, we feel that Korean wave and Hallyu has a firm foundation across the world, but we have to look back and reflect on why we target a certain markets, such as Japan or the United States. Because if we talk to the production companies in the field, they tell us that in the relations between Japan and Korea, when a certain content is sold in Japan, that this leads to big profits. And maybe this could explain away why we did not make inroads into the northern region as much. So we have to ask ourselves, why did we not venture into those territories? Perhaps we should change around our mindset and try to make inroads into those territories and also try to broaden our perspective and look at the globe, look at a global perspective. This northern region is similar to us in that we're in a similar Asian region. And so we have to look at the northern region as a partner, particularly in the field of cultural content. So when we talk about K-pop or K-dramas, these different keywords that we use, this content is made by people. It is humans who work on them, and you have to really inspire people and move people's hearts. And that is very difficult to do. So if you don't have a clear and deep understanding of the culture of the other country, then that could lead to several crisis situations. So instead of approaching this from the mindset of we have a product, let's go and sell it in a market, we have to think about it differently. And I would like to make some proposals. The first of which is that we have to look at this from the perspective of collaboration. We can think about joint ventures, joint co-productions, but in the past, when we've had extensive capital infusion, we were very happy. Korean production companies loved getting that extra funding, and we would think that this is great. We have a production budget, and so let's have a co-production to create these blockbuster productions. That's what we've seen in the past. But instead of looking at it from that point of view, we should try to broaden our perspective and maybe look at areas where the state funding can go into provide some support. Maybe we can go to the northern region and shoot a film or shoot a TV drama there. And maybe the state can subsidize those filming costs. So that can allow for a win-win cooperation. And it could also allow for tourism revitalization and tourism development in those regions. So this is something that the governments can work together on between Korea and the northern regions. And also from the content makers, the creators, obviously, they have to be mindful of profit creation. So we have to think about ways on how we can generate profits, maybe provide training and education experiences, maybe create more projects where these different creators can come in and work together. And secondly, we have to think about ways where the citizens can come in and play a role. In Korea, we don't have a very extensive knowledge of northern regions. This has been mentioned by other speakers. So perhaps we can host cultural festivals in Korea. I think that is a very good attempt, and maybe do something more online, because we can have all of these different experiences in a virtual way. But it's just that we haven't really thought about these creative solutions. So this is in a blind spot for us. So for example, these mukbang creators who do shows on eating food, mukbang creators in Russia, a mukbang creator is making kimchi, and videos on making kimchi can be uploaded to YouTube, and it generates a lot of interest and a lot of views and clicks. And so this is something that creators can collaborate with online, and maybe the Russian ambassador. These creators call themselves ambassadors. And that's very interesting to see. And this is something that we can look at as a way to develop as a new kind of content in this new media landscape, where many citizens, average citizens, are creating content and generating content. So maybe there is a way for us to work together in that regard. This is sort of a macro, this can be more effective than a macro level of cultural cooperation, doing something more in an online sphere. So I think that maybe we can expand on those types of exchanges. And thirdly, we have to think about the localization of content, some sustainable ways for content localization. About 15 years ago, I remember Seotaeji, when Seotaeji went on a ship and rode to Vladivostok so that he could put a performance there. I think that those types of experiences have to be more expanded. I think that at the time, KTNG was the sponsor of his concert in Vladivostok. Now, many Hallyu production companies have local training systems. They export these training systems to different markets so that they can allow for the debut of idol stars and young musicians. Typically, this is done in places like China or Japan, but maybe we can shift our focus to northern countries as well. That is all. Thank you. That was Dr. Lee Jae-won. I'm very sorry that I'm not able to give sufficient time to all of the discussants. We'd now like to move on to our next speaker, the Director General of the Office of Education and Public Relations at Northeast Asian History Foundation, Choi Un-do.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As introduced, I am Choi Un-do. I'm Director General of the Office of Education and Public Relations at the Northeast Asian History Foundation. First of all, I'd like to thank the HK+ National Strategies Research Project Agency and the Digital Times for inviting me to this forum. And I mentioned all the organizers in their full names because the topic of this forum is promoted by the National Strategies Research Project Agency, and it is very much related to what I do in my organization. So that's why I mentioned. Recently in the media, you can see mentioning of hanbok and kimchi and all these cultural items that are mentioned in the media. So we need to think about the significance of culture. So there's mentioning of kimchi and hanbok. So then if you want to learn more about this, then they will contact Northeast Asian History Foundation. And we still are also trying to figure out what's happening. When you think about culture, what is it? What is culture? In short, it may include elements such as kimchi and culture. These are cultural elements that we may exchange, and these are the outcome of cultural exchanges. And it's not a matter of who owns kimchi and who has created hanbok and so on. So there are a lot of controversies over these cultural items, but it is not a matter of which is correct and which is right. Baekbam Kimgu was mentioned by Mr. Chong Jin, and it is about dividing culture and politics and economy, whether we only purely want to focus on culture only without discussing political or economic aspects. I was able to learn a lot from the keynote presentation. And I thought that we would have to promote bilateral cultural cooperation and also promote cooperation on intangible cultural heritage. That was mentioned by Mr. Kim in his keynote presentation. That was quite impressive. And I imagined how we could engage in cultural exchanges with Central Asia by expanding our realm of cooperation. And this will help us broaden our own horizon and our own understanding as well. But when you think about the northern region and its strategy, I looked at the map. There are 3 provinces of China, and there's Mongolia to the west, and then there's some Islam countries, and all the way to Europe. When I took a look at this map, it does not exist in void, but rather there are many surrounding countries such as China and Russia. So as soon as I saw these countries, I realized that it may not be easy to just have an ideal version of cultural exchange between Korea and Central Asia without considering all the surrounding countries. Of course, we should not take too seriously about the imperial attempts of these big powers, but we also have to take into account the overall trend and the overall phenomenon and the historical and other landscape. The Hallyu and the Korean culture phenomenon has been promoted by the government, indeed, but when a country's power and status is elevated, then people will begin to get more interest in the culture of that particular country as well. And I think that's what has happened to Korea in the past. Mr. Seong-in proposed to cooperate on preserving intangible cultural heritage, but it is not purely cultural heritage, but I'm sure that he made these proposals from a more diplomatic and strategic perspective. So it means that we have other goals, such as elevating the status of Korea by engaging in cultural cooperation and exchange. As I'm working at this Northeast Asian History Foundation, I realize that when you think about these murals that he mentioned in the keynote presentation, you can have a 3D representation of the murals, and the experts from my foundation went there to create this 3D modeling of the murals. Because these countries are bordered with China, there are some controversial issues. There are murals that portray the Hanbok kind of costume, and this may be used as evidence to argue that the Korea people went all the way to Central Asia and spread this costume culture, and China would not be happy about this kind of explanation because they think that the Hanbok costume is also from China. And our foundation has been carrying out some program with Mongolia, Vietnam, Central Asia, and Russia for history-related cooperation. This may also include some cultural elements. And when we work with these countries, they love to have cooperation and exchange, but at the same time, they cannot ignore the view and the position of China. And when there's some support from China, from Japan, for instance, then they would say, "Oh, we cannot express our position because of this and that for Tokdo issues." So, when you think about the Central Asian countries, there's Uzbekistan and Uyghur and Turkey. All these countries are influenced by China, even though they have different ethnic compositions. They are located near China, so they cannot escape from the influence of China. That is the reality. Our foundation has been trying hard to find effective ways to promote cultural innovation, cultural exchange, and what the foundation has been working on was to focus on Northeast Asian history with China and Korea and Japan and Mongolia. So we've been working on the Asian history research for the past 10 years. So when you think about promoting cooperation with the northern region, I think we may approach this from the history research perspective. The topic of the forum is the culture and strategies between the Korean Peninsula and the North. We have to really keep in mind that the Central Asian region and this Eurasian region are under the influence of China and the surrounding countries, and we have to keep that in mind in formulating our strategies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to extend my sympathies to Northeast Asian History Foundation for working so hard despite all of these different disputes and conflicts among the neighboring countries. Lastly, we would like to hear from Han In-hee, the Executive Advisor at the KU China Institute at Hankuk University. Because I'm the last person to speak, I have to say that I'm a little bit nervous because everyone who spoke ahead of me have already given such excellent remarks, so I don't know what more I can add, but perhaps I can provide some conclusion. This forum has been hosted to try to expand our capacity, our external capacity, focusing on research into the northern regions, to try to expand our relations with these northern regions going forward. So we want to expand our diplomatic capacity and really put this into a new perspective in the geopolitical situation of northern regions, and also provide some kind of policy alternative for us to work with in the future. And in that regard, I think that this forum is very meaningful. I read the keynote presentations ahead of time, and the remarks are all quite excellent, but I have to be a little bit skeptical of one thing. In your remarks, you talk about bidirectional cultural cooperation, which is very good. It's excellent. However, when we talk about cultural cooperation and cultural ties and exchange, do we all have a high level of understanding and recognition of the cultural diversity of other countries? Because I have to ask ourselves, we've always been very aggressive on how we can export and strategically raise awareness of Korean culture and Hallyu. In the end, this could lead to resistance. And so, for example, how much do we know about the Islamic culture, for example, which is a key culture of Central Asia? Do we have a very high level of understanding? Do we appreciate the Islamic culture? I don't think so, because the Korean culture is famously exceptional and it's very exclusionary of other cultures, and we don't have a lot of diversity. If you look at corporations also, when you go to trade fairs, this is the same criticism. And the Korean Trade Council has criticized the closed-mindedness and the closed nature of Korean culture, because Koreans say that we are a single ethnicity, we are a single people, and this is very closed. It's a closed kind of attitude to outside influences. We say that we have a very unique culture, but we have to move away from this sort of dogmatic thinking and try to move away from this close-minded thinking and this inferiority complex that we have against bigger countries like China. On January 30th, Minister Park of the Culture and Sports and Tourism has also stressed the importance of cultural diversity, and especially in the field of digitization, how we have to promote a cultural memorandum of understanding and sign different pacts and agreements on cultural diversity. So there's all this mention and talk about diversity, but I have to ask ourselves, are we really that committed to cultural diversity? Is there a way for us to promote and strengthen cultural diversity here in Korea? So, for example, do we have a very good level of understanding about Islamic culture? Is there a way for us to try to promote this level of understanding and awareness? I think that it'd be interesting and helpful for this HK project to try to expand its scope and also try to foster understanding of the Islamic culture and history. This hanbok and kimchi dispute that we have with China, I think that this provocation from China, it's difficult for us to fight it when we ourselves are not embracing cultural diversity. Can we really be critical of China's stance when we ourselves are not being very mindful of diversity? So when we think about these raindrops, and the raindrops, these single raindrops keep falling, and they fall from a higher ground to a lower ground, and they continue to spread outwards in concentric circles. You cannot say that because I'm at the center, I was the first raindrop, that this is all mine. That's not the correct way of thinking. So China has this lack of understanding about its own culture, about its own history, when it attacks us and says that kimchi and hanbok actually belongs to them. So we don't want to repeat the same mistake of China. We want to try to have a very transcendent spirit of understanding and embracing the cultures of other countries so that we can become a more mature country in that regard. And that is what I want to stress. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Han. We've heard from 7 panelists on different issues. They've commented on the keynote presentation, so I'd like to give about 5 to 7 minutes to the keynote speaker.
Well, I would like to mention that I am not as knowledgeable about this topic as all the experts who are here in this panel discussion. I was able to learn a lot, and I was able to learn from your comments. Rather than making my comments on your responses, I would like to share with you my situations. When I was given this homework, it was about culture of northern region, and I thought a lot about it because the northern region includes China and Russia. China in itself is a very big country, and Russia is also another very big country. And how can I cover this entire region in my keynote presentation? So I decided to zoom in on to the Silk Road as my focal point in the keynote presentation. That's how I organized my keynote speech, and that may be why there was a narrower scope in my discussion. There were many comments and suggestions made by the panel members. Thank you very much. I will take them into account. But as I was doing my homework, I realized that when you think about these tangible cultural assets along the Silk Road, as I was trying to find common ground, there was not much interest in this. That is the first reason. And as for the second reason, there was not much need for tangible cultural asset related cooperation. But when it comes to intangible cultural heritage, these Central Asian countries lack technical skills and expertise in preserving the intangible cultural heritage. And they think that Korea has better expertise. And with the support from UNESCO and the Secretariat, they would like to receive some assistance from Korea in preserving the intangible cultural asset. So I didn't have any other intention, but just to mention that there was such a need or a request from Central Asia regarding this type of assistance. And there are many ideas proposed by the panel members, and also there are some difficult situations because of China and Russia, and there are many sensitive issues. And we also, of course, have to define have a better definition of Eurasia or the northern region. And also, we need a more tailored cultural strategy. And as Professor Oh mentioned, when we think about this new northern concept, we need to consider whether we need to make a transition because it's not just about the Hallyu, but it is also about establishing national strategies based on scholarly discussions with experts, and then we can provide some guidance and suggestions to the government. And this is something that government officials cannot handle properly because they don't have academic expertise. So the scholars would have to play a role in this regard. And Dr. Lee Jae-won made some important comments. We will consider this from a collaborative perspective, as was pointed out. How can we continue on with cooperation and collaboration that will mutually benefit the concerned parties? So there is this the aspect of whether we can go on with bidirectional cooperation, bidirectional cultural cooperation. I want to share with you my experience. In 2014, there was the Korea-ASEAN Special Summit meeting held in Korea, and their discussions were that Korea is enjoying a huge trade surplus from ASEAN, but Koreans tend to look down upon ASEAN people. So there was this big critique from the ASEAN countries. And I was not able to respond to this right away, but we said that we would try to promote ASEAN culture in Korea. So with the funding from ASEAN and with the support from the Busan city, we built a building, which is the ASEAN Culture House. This is a place where cultural events will be promoted, and there will be a promotion of ASEAN culture to the Korean public. And when you look at this Central Asia, Brunei, and ASEAN countries, there are many Muslim countries, and they wanted a prayer room. So we created that prayer space inside the ASEAN Culture House. We may not able to accommodate all the cultural requests, but we've been doing our best to accommodate as much as possible. So that can be a good example that we can refer to in promoting cultural cooperation with the northern region. Then when it comes to the practical matters, because I have been involved in the actual economic cooperation and ministerial cooperation between Korea and in Central Asia, and this includes both economic, cultural, political, and other aspects. And this is a diplomatic consultative body as well. But our concerns or challenges are that when you look at the Central Asia, there's this issue of membership. For instance, Turkey is an example. When they try to expand the membership of Central Asia, there are many issues, and that's why there's only 5 countries in Central Asia when it comes to their membership, and this is something that we need to consider as well. Moving on to the actual cultural cooperation, what we have been struggling with is when we think about the northern region, and when we promote cultural cooperation, I think we have to be careful. Because when you think about the economic cooperation, there are clear interests. For instance, developing oil and gas in Russia and other economic projects can be pursued. But when it comes to culture, there should be more reciprocity established. For instance, we not only want to introduce our culture, we want to embrace your culture, learn from your culture. So there should be that spirit of reciprocity and bi-directionality in promoting cultural cooperation. I really appreciate all these comments, and I hope that there will be another chance to make these kinds of discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you all know, the Korea Foundation is really the leader in announcing and promoting Korean culture and Korean studies to the world. And we've also had the opportunity to hear from our keynote speeches early on in the morning session. And I do think that we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. We have to place importance on national interest, but we also want to think about those areas where the whole of humanity can come together, universal values that can resonate with all of us. And one of those could be cultural values. We did have many academics and experts and government officials here. There are some areas where we overlap. There are some differences in opinion among us, but I think that through consistent research, we can try to resolve all of these different challenges going forward. And I hope that our project agency can play a role in that regard. We wanted to invite our overseas experts as well, but because of COVID-19, as you know, we were unable to do so. So perhaps next year we can have a more expanded forum and bring in scholars from other countries as well. I'd like to thank our panelists and especially our keynote speaker, Professor Seong-in. Thank you very much.